So my first question for you, sir, is how was your off season? Question mark.
Off season was great, John. Thank you so much for asking. And it was actually a quicker off season than I was used to because Carolina Panthers had a much longer season than they had in previous years with the late playoff run and obviously their playoff game in January created a little bit of a shorter off season for us. So not as much time for big trips, not as much time for everything else, but. As it always is when it comes down to the way a season ends for a club, the offseason never feels as long as it is, but it always just kind of feels like the season sneaks right up to you, and it's like, where'd all the time go? So we're excited to get it going.
What are some of your larger takeaways from the 25 season when it comes to what you saw with Charlotte FC?
So I think the biggest thing was that it was such a roller coaster, I think, because we started out playing incredibly well, got ourselves up to first place in the league, and that was even a period of time where Dean Smith had said, "Look, we feel like we're leading a charmed life in terms of results. You don't feel like we're playing all that well, yet we're winning games, and hopefully we can get the actual game playing right." And then you got into a point where you took on some water with the injuries. You had the 8 out of 10 stretch away from home, which really kind of derailed things. And that was a period of time where Dean Smith even said, "Look, I think we're not playing all that bad. I don't think we're that far off. We're just not getting the results." And there were a couple of different late results that didn't go their way. They were in Philadelphia. They had Kansas City where they lost a result. So there was some, I would say, lack of fortune in portions. There was also the unfortunate downturn in the middle of the season of Christian Kalina. So that part had kind of really derailed where the early start had gone. And then somehow, some way in July, just the switch flipped. They win 9 games in a row. They get Nathan Byrne back, and I think we all very much underrated how much of a big factor he was into Charlotte FC's good play, particularly in the back line. They had a couple of positions that they needed to really sort out throughout the season, including left back, which never really felt like it was settled until they got Harry Toffolo. And unfortunately, Toffolo gets hurt in his first start. So it's even a situation where it's like, hey, you feel like you have this problem solved. And then all of a sudden you're having to go back to a bit of a band aid program. So I don't think there was a point in time where after the month of, say, April, where you really felt like they were truly whole until you really got near, that middle part of July. And even then, Pep Biel goes out. And I would argue Pep Biel, if he's with Charlotte FC for the latter stretch of the run, maybe they finish in a better position. They don't have some of those fluky results at the end, like Montreal and even some of the others. And also, I think they're advancing in the playoffs beyond the first round. I think they definitely missed him in that playoff series against New York City. An incredible anomaly in this brand new format. A home team that wins its second game to force a third game, doing so on the road, and yet unfortunately unable to close a deal. A team that had really thrived on home form, 13 out of 17 in the win column in the regular season, but they lose 2 in the playoffs and in regulation. And so I think that the biggest thing I take away, John, is that so much of this team was really living on thin margins. And one of the things Dean Smith and Zoran Cornetta tried to address during this offseason is trying to make sure that those margins aren't as thin, to increase a little bit of the depth, but also I think a lot of it too is leaning on that core, which they feel like they've built over the first 2 years of Dean Smith's regime.
And then you look at the ins and outs when it comes to personnel, and if my numbers are correct, it's 10 individuals out and basically half of that coming back in. When you look at where things are now coming into the 26 season with the hashtag replacements, what do you think about the new looks and the new faces with Charlotte coming in?
So it's interesting, John, because like when you break it down like that, they did lose 10 senior roster players, but a lot of those guys weren't people who necessarily logged a lot of minutes. And it got very, very evident that Dean Smith did not have a lot of guys that he could trust to change a game off the bench. And a lot of players who had to play sometimes out of necessity, but weren't necessarily what he would consider to be choices he'd want to have to make. And so I think a lot of the trimming happened on the margins. Of course, the biggest loss was Adilson Malanda to Middlesbrough. Even though that transfer happened in the summer transfer window, he did not depart until the winter. So that was always going to be the biggest thing they had to replace. At the beginning of the offseason, Zoran Cornetta told us, he said, we need to obviously add, maybe one or two starters. But if we don't add a second starter, it more than likely is that somebody is taking over Adilson Malanda's spot within our program already. And they feel like they have that with Andrew Privet, who had a very, very good 2023. Dean Smith basically said that he was our player of the year in 2023. And as you know, in this league, John, it's very, very difficult to replace outgoing defensive talent that moves on as a result of a better opportunity. Going to the English Championship and being on the precipice of the English Premier League, I think we all can agree is something of an improvement for Adilson Malanda on his situation from Charlotte, despite how much they had been really taking care of him over the course of his time. So I do think it's an interesting situation in terms of how they went about the offseason, because they added at a position that I didn't think a lot of people they thought they would add it when they signed Luca De La Torre, who was at least in my opinion the biggest of the incomings from Charlotte FC's perspective. He presents somebody who, quite frankly, Charlotte FC's never had a box to box eight with offensive prowess, and that is not to denigrate or say anything bad about one of my favorites, Brant Bronico. It's just that's not what you go to him for. You go to him for grit. You go to him for defensive presence, and any offense you get out of him is a bonus. But they found out that they were missing that connecting pass that either came from the back line or Ashley Westwood up until Wilfred Zaha, Pep Biel, and the wingers, as well as Edon Toklamati. They did not have that particular level of the chain really taken care of. So they bring in Luca De La Torre. They also bring in Henry Kessler. They bring in David Schnegg, who, quite frankly, I think is a very, very shrewd signing, because he would have started at left back for us last year. I think it's going to be a very interesting competition between him and Harry Toffolo. I think Schnegg will definitely get starts in the midweek because Harry is a little bit older, and Schnegg obviously represents somebody who they really feel very, very good about. They made changes at the backup goalkeeper position, getting rid of Trey Callender to go to Minnesota and bringing in Tyler Miller. And then the rest of the additions, so to speak, are going to be players who really kind of come in from the Crown Legacy editions, and also guys who are, as I would call it, the sign and stash players, people who took the Toklamati route, who sign with Crown Legacy and make their way up through the ranks. They brought in, a Morrison Ajima, no relation to Patrick. They feel very, very high about his particular plaudits. They brought in Rodolfo Oloco last season. They feel very, very confident about him. And then there are other guys who, Dean Smith has said so much about a healthy club is being able to finally start tapping your resources from within. So you may see Emmanuel Ochegbu get first team minutes after having a very stellar Crown Legacy season last year. They got a couple of draft picks who they really liked. The draft somewhat was a bit of a lost cause for Charlotte FC during the 2024 campaign, the 24 draft into the 25 season. They did draft Andrew Johnson in that draft, but he went back to college at Cornell. He's going to play mostly for Crown Legacy this year, but he's signing what we believe is a first-team contract here this year as well. And Will Cleary, who they liked as well out of this year's draft, can very well be a backup right back for them, maybe get some minutes at Crown Legacy as well, and kind of help fortify that depth. It's a long way of answering your ingoings and outgoings question, but I do think it's one of those things where there wasn't the flashy signing, John, but I think there were points in time where they made some shrewd moves. They took care of the margins, but they also, again, wanted to maintain a lot of that, at least front four core and that midfield core that makes them very, very tough to beat, and hopefully a little bit more offensively dynamic in 2026.
Okay, two dudes I have in mind for my next two questions, and I will let you tackle them in the order that you wish. Wilf Zaha and his adjustment to Major League Soccer, and Major League Soccer's adjustment to him,
Sure.
and the emergence of Edon Toklamati to my fantasy team, which I thank you for, by the way, and just his adjustment to what it was like to be up front in the attack for Charlotte. So dealer's choice, but you got to hit them both eventually.
I will get to Zaha first because his story has a lot of intrigue surrounding it for a lot of reasons, but foremost in that he's only under contract through the end of the month of May. His contract is up at the end of June. We obviously know they're not playing any games in June because of the World Cup. So really the next 15 games serve as a better, for no better word than that, a tryout for basically whether or not he's going to be the DP for Charlotte FC for the next year or plus. But I do think that near the middle part to the end part of the season, you saw a different Wilfred Zaha than you saw at the beginning of the season. Absent, of course, the first game against Atlanta, where he took the league by storm with that one goal. But even Dean Smith said, "Look, he hadn't played a lot of competitive football over the previous 6 to 8 months, so there was obviously going to be an acclimation period, not only getting back to match fitness for him, but also getting himself used to this league." And you saw the league struggle to adjust to him. You saw him struggle to adjust to the league. The way the game is called is a lot different. But you saw a lot of the things that happened to him in the Premier League happen to him in MLS because of the fact that he was the most fouled player in Major League Soccer, just like he was the most fouled player in the English Premier League. He set a single season record for most fouls sustained, which is something that he did in the Premier League as well. So I do think it's a situation where you're going to see that happen again. But I think the one thing that he has brought it to the table is that, you know, the team around him loves him. And I think they needed to get used to somebody who was on his skill level, but held them accountable. I think you had guys who held people accountable like Ashley Westwood. And that's not to say that Westy and Wilf are on different skill levels, but obviously Wilf does a lot more of the glamorous things like score goals, fiery assists, and obviously has that name recognition that is pervasive across MLS. And so when you hear it, when it comes from that guy, people kind of jump back and are like, okay, how is that happening? And I think it even threw the fan base off a little bit, saying, man, this guy really just kind of belly aches and whines, when in reality all he's doing is saying, hey, I know your standard is better and my standard is at that level too, and I need both of us to be on the same page. And I think you're seeing a lot more of that kind of come throughout the regular season, and you saw it in the offseason as well. I think playing in the African Cup of Nations was something that he was very, very proud of, and I think has invigorated him as well. I expect a very intriguing season for him in 2026, and I believe, as long as he continues to produce, I think Charlotte FC wants him to stay. So that's very much a story to monitor. Edon Tuklamadi's story, obviously incredibly fascinating. The 11 goals he scored last year, it did kind of feel like after the hat trick against Miami that he did drop off. He went 6 games goalless at the end of the regular season and into the playoffs. So that is one thing that maybe represents a minor concern. But if you saw anything at the end of the Coachella Valley Invitational in California, you know that he's definitely on the mark. He had 2 very, very different goals, but that were set up in very, very similar ways because of crosses that came from the right, which is incredibly intriguing, knowing that Wilfred Zaha didn't really have a hand in the buildup with either of those goals. And you saw a player in Toklamadi completely make no mistake and have incredible ingenuity. He can score goals in a variety of different ways, in more different ways than his predecessor Patrick Adjaman did when he was here. Although Patrick Adjaman seems to have found the header now that he's going to Derby County, which is something that I think a lot of Charlotte FC fans are wondering, like, where was that in your locker, Big Pat, when you were here in Charlotte FC? But one of the things that's intriguing about Toklamadi is that they gave him the number 9 shirt before the season. They basically said, okay, we are basically putting this on your back. Zoran Canetta was very adamant at the end of the season and even during the summer transfer window, saying, we're not selling Edon Tuklamadi for any price. He is our player, and we want to keep him that way for the foreseeable future. So they believe in him, and they feel like they also have a good striker to kind of push him from behind, and Archie Goodwin. Archie kind of came here at the end of last season, didn't really get a lot of run up because he was still trying to get himself acclimated and obviously having an off season in Australia, not really up to full fitness yet. I feel like I will quote and reference the Goss theorem that Archie Goodwin may have a very good way of making sure that he pushes Toklamadi to even greater heights in this upcoming year.
All right. So a couple of other questions, and thanks for hanging out as you always do for the preview and for the key moments during the season.
Sure.
With all of the shiny objects that we've been talking about so far leading into the 2026 season, give me someone who's second level that if things are going well for Charlotte, we should focus not just on Zaha, Toklamadi, et cetera, Kalina, et cetera, but who are those second level dudes that would be key to the success for Charlotte in 26, you think?
The biggest question is what happens at right wing outside of the gentleman that you mentioned. And that's, I think, the biggest unanswered question outside of can they replace Adilson Malanda is what's happening at right wing. Kerwin Vargas ended the season at right wing. I think he had a very resurgent campaign. while the goals are still not there at the level that I think a lot of people want them to be, he is a better all-around player now than when he started with Charlotte FC in their inaugural season, coming over as a at the beginning of the season transfer. He didn't start the year with the club, but he came over in the primary transfer window and was very, very effective in a lot of moments over the course of his campaign, but was very defensively limited. Dean Smith has gotten him to play a lot better defense, and that's why he's beaten Liel Abada out head-to-head. But Abada has looked very, very good in the preseason. He had 2 assists in that game that I referenced against Minnesota United that set up the 2 Edon Tuklamati goals. It seems like there is an appetite from not only Dean Smith, but the front office to see what they have out of Liel Abada, just because of the fact that they put more money into him than any player they've had in their history. He's on a higher wage bill than anybody not named Zaha. And I do think there's a very much, this is where the rubber meets the road, because I know they tried to figure out whether or not they can get him either on a loan or put him somewhere else during this past offseason. They didn't like the number attached to him because the numbers just weren't there. The productivity was not there for a player who came out of Celtic with a lot of promise, and somebody who Charlotte FC got at a significant discount because he wasn't a player that Celtic really wanted to have to move. It moved, obviously, because of the off-the-field circumstances involving Celtic and the situation involving what was happening in Israel. So I say all that to say, if Charlotte gets consistent productivity out of that right-wing position, that, I think, determines how high their ceiling goes. I think there's always going to be a consistent ceiling with regard to Wilfried Zaha and Edon Tuklamati and Pep Biel, but those 3 cannot do it alone. The thing that is going to make this engine roar is if you have the ability to provide a threat on the right side, because that gets Wilfried Zaha out of double and triple teams. That gets Pep Biel out of a crowded middle. That gets Edon Tuklamati away from stingy and sticky center backs. And that is what's going to put Charlotte FC in a position where they can score more goals, because while they scored a club record amount of goals, it still was not a situation where you felt like they scored enough down the stretch. And that was something that really bogged them down in the postseason. This is a team that, John, when it comes down to it, has scored 1 open play goal in the last 2 postseasons. 2, actually, now that I think about it, because the 2 open play goals in the last 2 postseasons in 6 games. 2 open play goals in the last 6 games in season. And the season before that, they did score they scored 2 open play goals, but they also had a hat trick from Elias Manuel that they had to deal with against New York Red Bulls. So 2 open play goals in the postseason in the last 2 seasons. One was from Karol Swiderski against Orlando in game number 3. And the other was from Edon Tuklamati with a consolation goal in game 3 last year. They got shut out in the first 2 contests. Scoreless draw in game 2 and a 1-0 loss in game 1 on Alonso Martinez worldie. So I say all that to say, when the competition level gets to a point where you're playing the biggest competition, you're playing in the playoffs, you've got to find ways to score goals. And it's going to have to come from a threat on the right wing to support the other 3 front players. Because if it doesn't happen there, then Charlotte's going to look very predictable, and it's going to be a hard sledding for them when they try to move up in what is a very competitive Eastern Conference.
And my last question for you, you kick off the season as the curtain pull on 2026, and you get to go out to All Caps SC. And I was looking at, well, I feel like you have to say it. Everything's normal. You hit that 4-letter word, and you have to say it in all caps. But you look at the numbers, and the juice boxes have Charlotte as a decided underdog, which I find interesting going into Energizer. Juice boxes have St. Louis at plus 108 and Charlotte at plus 2.25. I thought that was a wide margin for you guys on the road going into a situation in St. Louis being what it is.
Yeah, and I find that to be incredibly head scratching, I would say, is the biggest thing. And this is not to be disrespectful of St. Louis, but if you look at where Charlotte is in their build and where St. Louis is in their build, they're 2 completely different situations. St. Louis is very much in a rebuild. They're on their 5th head coach in 4 years, and it's a situation where you're looking at a completely revamped game model. They're going to play 3 at the back, we assume, because that's what they looked like during the preseason. And you lost Joao Klaus. You lost a lot of firepower in the midfield. You still have Marcel Hartel Holiday in. If you start backing up, then you take her friend. But at the same point in time, like, who's around him? Who's running with him? I don't know. I don't know if they're going to get the guy Cordova over the line in time for them to have him play on Saturday. So it's going to be possibly Simon Becker as the number 9 striker. Does that guy strike fear into your heart? Not necessarily. As a Jong Sang Bin, there's, I think, maybe a desire for them to play a little bit more possession, which could potentially go about looking from a standpoint where Charlotte FC is at. And maybe if you keep away against Charlotte, you're able to really turn things around. But the one thing I will say is if they play a lower line of confrontation, we've seen Charlotte FC struggle with that a lot in previous iterations of the Dean Smith game model, particularly last year. I remember a game at Miami last year where they didn't have Lionel Messi and they were down to 10 men. And Miami, after scoring what was a very, very craftily awarded and earned goal at the beginning of the second half with 10 men, they basically parked the bus, the airplane, the canoe, everything in front of it, and played the biggest impenetrative shell that I've seen a 10-man in the 4 years I've been doing this, and Charlotte could not get anything done. So I think maybe that's the reasoning why. And I also just know that in this league, when it comes to those who set out the juice boxes and put them in the places where they're supposed to be, there's a lot that rides on home versus road. And maybe that's what they're thinking about. The one thing that is incredibly intriguing about this 15-game stretch, the first 3 games for Charlotte against teams we haven't seen in the last 2 seasons. We're going to play St. Louis, Galaxy, and Austin. I think the most recently that we've played any of those 3 is Galaxy in 24, because we didn't play St. Louis City after basically that first game at Energizer Park. It's the last and only time we've seen them. We've seen Austin twice, once in 24, and then once or twice in the first 2 years. But we haven't seen either any of these first 3 teams really since that part of it. So I will say there's also been a lot of just, I don't want to say down talk on Charlotte FC from the group at large. And the reason is because they're looking at the incomings and outgoings from Charlotte, and they're looking at the incomings and outgoings from all the other teams. Nashville gets Christian Espinoza. Miami does what they do. Chicago has additions, and other teams feel like they made greater additions than where Charlotte FC did, when Charlotte's best addition, at least from the people at large, is Luca De La Torre. And run it back. It's a very, very hard thing to do in this league. From what people tell me, it's very, very hard to run it back with the same group and feel like you're going to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. But they believe in their product, they believe in their game model, and they believe in the continuity that they've developed in terms of this core. I would put Charlotte FC as a favorite in the opening week. I think Galaxy is going to be a tough sled, but if you can get out of this next 2 games with 4 points coming into a home game against Austin that's winnable, puts you in good position here to do something of consequence in these first 15 games, which, again, I think are going to be very, very different than the way we've seen the season previously, because of just knowing we have that line of demarcation at the World Cup, and you're going to have the window that happens in concert with that. It's going to create basically a primer for what is to come for MLS, because that's going to be our new world order come 27-28, is that you're going to have a little bit of a blitz. You're going to have a long break. You're going to have a winter window, and then you're going to have a sprint to the finish. And it's going to feel very much like that during this different truncated campaign.
And for those that wish, during the season at large, if they wish to listen to you and your coverage in Charlotte FC, how do they do it, sir? Let them know.
We'll be on WFNZ again, 92.7 FM, and a bunch of stations across the Carolinas. Actually, we just picked up a brand new affiliate in Wilmington, ESPN Wilmington, so that's very, very cool. For those of you who might be watching or listening to us down by the ocean front of the North Carolina North State, so that's pretty cool. We're also up in the Triad in the Greensboro area, and also have a couple of stations across Raleigh and also Lynchburg. So very much looking forward to talking to the people again once again this year. Anna Whitty is back for her second year alongside me on the coverage as well. WFNZ 92.7 FM on Twitter at Willie P Style, and hopefully we've got 34 good games and a longer run in the postseason.
As always, my friend, great to see you. Can't wait for week number 1 for the sprint, then the cup, then the sprint, and then the sprint, and then back to 27-28. Good to see you, my friend. Don't be a stranger.
Yeah, we don't see you guys until the first game after the World Cup, correct? July 20th?
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan to me.
It's going to feel odd not seeing Atlanta for that long of a time.
Crazy and silly. Obviously, you know that you've got the garage door opener. You can come in anytime you wish, and we can break bread and we'll talk about things. Always good to see you, my friend.
Thank you, John. Always appreciate it. Have a good year.